My name's Craig Schleicher. I'm the head of innovation at City National Bank. I've had a few people stop me and ask, what's City National Bank doing at an entertainment technology event? And I think we're really in an interesting position as a bank where we are both working with clients that have major roles in shaping the future of entertainment technology, and we're actively involved in the payments ecosystem and some of the trends that are impacting distribution, both through work that the bank is doing ourselves, as well as a few software companies that we've acquired in recent years. So I will touch a little bit on what we're doing at the bank, but mostly this is intended to be a pretty high-level lay of the land and introduction of how some of the trends in entertainment technology are changing monetization and how creators and talent and the different entities that are involved throughout the value chain get compensated for the work that they're doing in entertainment. So I'll start off with a little bit of housekeeping. I am from City National Bank, but these are my views, not the views of the bank. These are a few things that my legal and compliance team always wants to make sure that I cover. So I'm definitely not giving investment advice. If I was, you wouldn't want to trust me around that topic anyway. I am not endorsing individual companies. Really, this is meant to just be a representative discussion of companies that are examples of some of the trends that we're seeing in the industry. And so this is general informational purposes only. Now that we've got that boring stuff out of the way, we can move on to really the meat of the presentation, which is to say, there are major impacts from technology across every aspect of the entertainment value chain. And when I'm talking entertainment here, I'm using the term pretty generally because we see that many of the same trends and impacts are common, whether we're talking about music or film or television or some of the new forms of content that are emerging, whether that's immersive content, short form content. There are lots of different ways that people are creating content and engaging with audiences. And this is a vastly oversimplified view of the value chain. And really this is from a production perspective, and the audience journey looks slightly different as we think about discovery and some of those aspects. So there's a lot more happening than what's shown on this slide. But we really see that when we look at how are the different players in this industry making money, we see major impacts to the distribution and payment section. So digital rights management, the platforms for payments, how are you distributing the content and getting it to your audience? But we also see data and analytics being used across every aspect, from greenlighting concepts, deciding what to finance, improving aspects of production, all the way through then to the consumption end, where it's how do I engage with my audience? How do I measure the level of engagement that I'm getting? How do I make changes to the way in which I interact with my audience to drive loyalty and to drive additional consumption? So there's so much going on that I can't really give a deep dive into each of those aspects individually. So I'm going to try to cover the highlights of some of these themes and touch on some of the aspects that are interrelated and touching broad sectors of entertainment. You'll notice that every speaker who comes on after me, and if you had a chance to see yesterday's presentation, knows a lot more about this topic than I do and will give much greater depth on aspects of it. But hopefully you'll see that a lot of the topics that I'm talking about relate to some of the areas where you saw deep dives, especially some of the topics related to metadata. Yesterday was a common theme. So let's start off by looking at just the changing distribution landscape. And I'm going to start with an example in the video space, but similar themes again are playing out elsewhere in entertainment. So when we look at the video on demand platforms, we can see a couple of different revenue models that have emerged: subscription, transaction-based advertising. We're all familiar with these, not just in our roles in the entertainment industry, but also just as consumers of these services. And it's really interesting to see the fragmentation that's occurred in a lot of ways of all of these different platforms that have different ways of charging for their content and different formats for their content. And that's created a ton of complexity when we think about licensing in those structures. And I apologize for the fact font size is a little bit small here, but the main takeaway from this slide is really just that as you think about video on demand, there isn't one guiding set of rules that governs how licensing is managed. Each contract has unique terms, and there's a high level of complexity in terms of how creators get paid, who gets a cut, how do you manage it? You may have the same content distributed on different platforms in different geographies with different rules that govern it. So as you think about that and you think about how am I going to make money for the content that I've created or the content in my library that I have the rights to as a publisher or as another entity that is involved in distribution of content. There's a lot of complexity just with determining who is owed what, when are they owed it, how do I want to process, what are the terms of those deals, did the person that is distributing it actually have the right to distribute it? So there's a lot of interrelationship between digital rights management and payment. And so if I shift gears a little bit from video to music, music royalties is an area where we have seen one of our portfolio companies, Exactuals, is playing a role here in basically simplifying the process of sharing data between the payer and the payee to make sure that everyone's on the same page about who is owed what, when are they supposed to be paid, and how do I manage all of these complex microtransactions that are associated with the music royalties space. So that's everything from calculating what's owed, the registration of the IP, the payments, and the reporting. And data is absolutely critical to that, but we've especially found that metadata is really important. So a statistic that you may have heard bandied around from different sources is that there are over $2 billion in unclaimed music royalties. And a lot of this comes down to just the fact that if you look at the same recording and the same work across different platforms, the same name may just be documented in slightly different ways. And especially for recordings that have existed for longer periods of time before data structures and data governance were considered as strongly, there's a lot of inconsistencies in terms of how these works and these recordings are reported. And that leads to artists not being compensated in the way that they should. So one of the projects that Exactuals has worked on is they have an artificial intelligence solution that analyzes metadata and finds matches between those recordings and those works. And that's a really interesting application of data helping to ensure that the process functions the way it's supposed to function. And when we think about artificial intelligence, that matching of the metadata may not be the first use case that comes to mind, but we found that those very narrowly focused practical applications are some of the areas where technology in the short term is having some of the most significant impacts. And so as I look at the landscape of where are the opportunities in payments and in digital rights management, we see a lot of opportunity around real-time reporting, around blockchain and smart contracts, and having terms that execute automatically as they're fulfilled, really making sure that there's no question in the chain of ownership and the rights and the structures around what causes a contract to be fulfilled. We also see changes in terms of payment rails, and as we think about international distribution and multi-currency solutions and being able to manage foreign exchange, and we see a lot of activity in that space as well. And also in rights marketplaces, entities that previously wouldn't have been interested in having an ownership stake in the IP are now finding that it's an interesting alternative asset class. So you're seeing places where people are monetizing the rights and no longer dependent on the revenue streams that come in over time based on usage, but are actually monetizing them up front. And there are pros and cons to that. This isn't a conversation about what the best ways to monetize your rights are, but the really interesting piece is that technology's created those marketplaces and those exchanges that create choice and options for the entities that are involved. Another change that we've seen is really just the rise of the influencer and the creator and the direct audience engagement. And I don't need to tell you we're at a Google facility today. I don't need to tell you that YouTube is a big deal, but some of these statistics are really interesting, just hit home how these new forms of content, and I use new loosely because YouTube has been around for quite a while, but emerging and rapidly growing forms of consumption and live streaming as well are really changing the way in which we think about how talent engages with their audience. That's a really interesting area for City National Bank. We work with a lot of talent. We work with them through their representation, their business managers. And so one of the things that we like to stay up on top on is how does talent monetize the content that they create? How are they being compensated for that? And so when we look at how influencers make money, there are a bunch of different paths that they can take. I've grouped them into 3 categories. There are many more ways beyond this, but just an oversimplified view of it is there's the content consumption itself. So they may be making receiving payments based on the volume of views. They may be receiving advertising payments, some parallels to those video on demand revenue models we talked about, and they may be getting royalties and residuals. Then there's the influencer marketing space with sponsorships, brand partnerships, different models in which they are monetizing their value as a celebrity or as a known entity that other consumers trust. And then there's a category of audience engagement, and a lot of talent are getting much more sophisticated in terms of how they're using technology platforms to engage with their audience, to find new ways to provide value to their audience in an exclusive way, and to monetize the ability to create that dynamic fan engagement at scale and do it through technology platforms when previously it wouldn't have been possible to engage with their fans that are scattered across the globe on that personal level. So when we think about influencer marketing, one example of this is a platform that YouTube has called FameBit, where content is being produced and generated through the marketplace, connecting influencers with brands. There's really high volumes of activity, high levels of engagement, and a lot of opportunity for talent to monetize. And so we think primarily when we talk about influencers about this new breed of talent. But what we're finding increasingly is that your traditional celebrities, your traditional players in more established forms of media are also finding this a very valuable path to engage with their audiences. So yesterday and today we're talking about convergence. This is another great example of convergence where some of these trends that started in new media and streaming and esports in those areas, these same monetization models and audience engagement strategies are now being used by the movie stars, the television stars, and a generation of talent that previously wouldn't have been using this type of platform to monetize. And when we think about audience engagement, there are a ton of different tools that are being used. Some are tools that are being used to distribute content in new ways. Some are being used to establish communities and have two-way conversations with your audience and your fans. And some are being used to create exclusive subscriptions and tiers and access levels that allow you to monetize that relationship with your audience. So this is really an exciting time for someone that's a talented creator because they have more potential paths to revenue than they've ever had at their fingertips. And a lot of that, it may not be the most cutting edge technology. You've noticed I haven't spent a ton of time talking about AI yet. This really is just something where it's a digital economy, a marketplace economy, using technology for connectivity and for reach. And so when we talk about technology in the entertainment space, there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening with pretty sophisticated technology. But there's also a lot where technology can just help us rethink a business challenge or an issue that really isn't that complex. And so when we talk about technology, we like to talk about innovation as not just a technology problem. We like to talk about it as business process reengineering and finding new solutions to challenges that that are facing the industry, whether it's technology driven or not. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit though and talk about some of the areas where data and analytics are critical to driving those changes. And this is some topics that'll have overlap with some of the other presentations you'll hear later today. They'll go into much more depth, but I'm just going to give you a lay of the land of a couple of those areas where really data is allowing us to become much more sophisticated in decision making and how we approach different aspects of the industry. So these won't be examples that the bank is necessarily actively involved in, but just some examples of how some of our clients think about it or how other players in the industry are approaching this sort of analysis. And then what impact does that have on the other entities in the industry? So if we look at forecasting and predictive analytics, I think one of the interesting spaces is using analytics to predict earning potential. And studios are doing this, third parties are doing this. But then the artists and, the actors and the talent and actresses are really thinking about, well, what impact does this have for me? So it's not just financing and greenlighting and production, but it's also being used by actors and actresses to think about, is this the right role for me to take? How do I think about my casting decisions? How does this impact my earnings potential and my brand potential? as talent or as a creator. And so we're seeing that this is permeating not just the studios, but it's permeating talent agencies and other end users as well. So really it becomes a race for information and an edge from analytics to say who can make the most informed decisions and add the most value to their clients and their partners by having an edge in terms of thinking about what the potential financial impacts of decisions are. What's the impact of this film if I change the release date, if I change a casting decision, if I make some change to some element of what I'm producing. And then there's performance monitoring and thinking about, is what I'm doing working? Am I engaging with the audience? There's performance monitoring in terms of seeing how is the audience responding. There's also performance in terms of how is the talent performing. And so many of you are probably familiar with sabermetrics in professional sports, the trend towards data analysis and more sophisticated analysis of player performance. We're seeing a similar ecosystem that's technology enabled arise in esports and evaluating the performance in Fortnite, Overwatch, all of these new gaming platforms that are getting so much attention. And because of the digital nature of some of these platforms, the amount of data that's available for analysis is incredible. So we see computer vision and the ability to do entity recognition and track some of those movement trends through computer vision as a huge opportunity on the horizon that's going to allow us to become much more sophisticated and have access to types of measurement in digital channels that wouldn't otherwise have been available. And so now as we quickly look ahead, what's on the horizon? There are so many possibilities for where artificial intelligence, data, and analytics could go. But as we think about that value chain, the question is, to what extent are we going to see AI used for content creation? A lot of companies are out there that are working on this. And I think if we try to use cooking as an analogy, we're probably not yet to the place where AI is going to be your chef. But it can probably be your line cook. And we're probably getting close to the time when it can be your sous chef. So as we think about some of these technology aspects, it's not a matter of black and white. Is artificial intelligence going to replace this aspect of entertainment or that aspect of entertainment? It's a complement, it's a supplement, it's something that is a tool that's being used by the experts like the people in this room and the people who are going to be watching this online. How is it a tool that helps improve your performance in each aspect of your job and manage that entertainment value chain more effectively? So I'll wrap up by saying I'm really excited by the potential that we see for technology across entertainment. You're about to hear about some even more exciting developments that fit into some of these themes. And thank you so much for your time, for having me out here. Happy to discuss afterwards with anyone who has questions. And if you're watching online, feel free to connect through LinkedIn. Thank you.